Good day, and thank you for joining us today as we present along with our friends from the Council for Federal Cannabis Regulation. Today we're discussing the regulation of hemp cannabinoids, including opportunities and challenges for the industry. Before we begin, I need to cover a few housekeeping items. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can submit them through the Q&A widget at the bottom of your screen. We strongly encourage audience questions, and we will do our best to get to all of them before our hour runs out. Your questions will only be seen by presenters. Members of the press are reminded that questions for our FDA guest must be submitted to the FDA press office. And you can find answers to some common technical questions located in the help widget, also at the bottom of your screen. And with that out of the way, I'm Jack Jacobson. I'm an advisor at Thompson Coburn, and I'm one of the Council for Federal Cannabis Regulations advisors as well. To start today, I'd like to welcome the founder and board chair of CFCR, Sherry Orwitz, who has some opening remarks. Sherry?
Thank you, Jack. And on behalf of CFCR and my wonderful co-host, Jack Jacobson, and my regulatory guide here today, I'd like to just take a moment. CFCR is the only objective nonprofit working to bring stakeholders together, including the U.S. government. And together, I mean to learn from each other to create a safe and sensible framework for cannabis. I'd like to say I've heard a lot about the FDA punting, and we here at CFCR applaud the decision, perhaps slow to many in coming, but nonetheless welcoming the idea of not trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. So today, to discuss all of this, we have Scott Reifler, Christopher Murray, and Norm Birnbaum, Senior Advisor to FDA. Let me tell you a little bit about Scott. He has 45 years of cultivating and commercializing scientific and technological resources. Scott is currently the Chief Science Officer of Source Technology and Innovation Leader of Materials Development for Edible Product Forms within the cannabis space. Scott joined Source Technologies in June of 2017, and he and his team have developed a key waterborne platform for cannabinoid oils for the beverage and food industry. Scott has spent 20 years in the aerospace industry with an industry leader supplying the aircraft industry with structural adhesives and advanced composite systems. Talk about public safety. Scott is literally responsible for holding planes together. Let me also introduce you to Chris Murray. Chris, our friend from the North, a principal of Fox North Inc., a Canadian firm providing business, risk, regulatory, and strategic consulting. Prior to launching Fox North, Chris was one of the founding employees of Canopy Growth in 2013, and he held many strategic growth roles, including vice president. Chris was responsible for establishing the first medical marijuana direct-to-physician outreach program, expanding cannabis access through clinical development across Canada, and successfully facilitating the first commercial export of cannabis from Canada to the USA, and the first export of cannabis tissue cultures from the Canadian legal system. Prior to joining Canopy Growth, Chris served as a founding employee of Fullscript Natural Products and is recognized as a health policy expert. Welcome, Chris. And finally, Norm Birnbaum. Norm was the inaugural president of the Cannabis Regulators Association, known as CANRA, and served as an executive board member. Norm was the first director of cannabis programs for the state of New York, where he oversaw the regulation, administration, and policy development to New York State medical marijuana and industrial hemp programs, and led state efforts to legalize cannabis for adult use. This work resulted in the passage of the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act, legalizing cannabis for adult use and creating a consolidated office of cannabis management to oversee all cannabis industry sectors within the state. Norm was also responsible for the implementation of the Rhode Island cannabis program at the Office of Cannabis Regulation, as well as working in various capacities with various lawmakers, such as the U.S. Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo and U.S. Senator Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts. So, gentlemen, you three have well over 100 years of experience. So Jack and I will open this up with a few questions, and then we encourage you to feel free to engage with each other. as we want this to be more of a roundtable discussion. We know so little compared to you three, so we'll just try to get out of the way. I'll start with this. One big myth that exists about the Farm Bill is that I should be able to say it straight by now, but I'm just going to say CBD, a non-intoxicating compound found in cannabis, is legalized. It is true that the Farm Bill removes hemp-derived products from its Schedule I status under the Controlled Substances Act. But where the confusion comes in is legislation does not legalize CBD generally. It is still subject to FDA regulation. That understanding what that means is what I'd like to start with and start to unpack. And I'd like to turn to you, Scott, and say, can you unpack that and try to address the status of CBD? I think you're muted, Scott.
I apologize, I was muted. Yes, thank you very much, Sherry, and welcome to attendees, and my thanks to also the other speakers that are on the line. The Farm Bill created, well, first off, let me say that I'll give you my interpretation, and I'm gonna lean probably on Norman a bit here to keep me honest and make sure that I'm not misinterpreting things. The Farm Bill has created a path for hemp as a cash crop. We all know that marijuana is a controlled substance, Schedule I drug, therefore making it illegal. Hemp, of course, is a cannabis plant, comes from the same plant that marijuana comes from. But what the Farm Bill did was carve out a definition for hemp, a working definition, that in part describes hemp as a material that contains less than 0.3% delta-9 THC. And that distinction is fairly important. But by creating this carve-out, if you will, or adding a category of cannabis that is low in the intoxicating compound delta-9 THC, it creates, like I said, a pathway for a cash crop for the material. But it also opens up a pathway for the materials that are contained within the hemp plant, because per the Farm Bill definition, hemp, again, less than 0.3% delta-9 THC on a dry weight basis. Anything below that requirement, that is of the cannabis genus, is now exempt from the Controlled Substance Act. And that would be DEA's interpretation of the Controlled Substance Act. Now, with that carve out, it does something very interesting. It excludes from control tetrahydrocannabinoids, all of them. So if you have a plant that meets the definition of hemp, the materials contained within that plant are now exempt from this, it's DEA's interpretation that they are exempt from the Controlled Substance Act. And that opens the pathway for basically the whole category of what we would refer to as cannabinoids, THC compounds and derivatives. And I think we're all familiar with many of these. That would be things like CBD, of course, CBG, and so on and so forth. Another distinction that I think is important is while it removes these materials from the Controlled Substance Act, there are a whole range of regulatory platforms that materials must meet to become articles of commerce. So it's certainly legal to own CBD if it comes from a hemp plant. The question is if we're going to put it in a food or a supplement or into our article of commerce, does it meet those requirements as well? The Farm Bill also created the option basically for states to regulate hemp. In many cases, these are state-based rules that are often paralleled USDA or Department of Agricultural requirements. It also, in my view, creates the pathway now for these materials to capture status within FDA for things like food additives or supplements if we follow the appropriate regulatory paths. So with that as a start, Norm, did I butcher that too much, or is that a reasonable overview?
No, Scott, I think that's certainly a reasonable overview. A couple of things that I would mention. Sherry, to your question of what's the status here. Scott, you did a very good job of describing how hemp and hemp derivatives are removed from the Controlled Substances Act. So in terms of your ability to possess these products, yes, you're not going to be subject to any type of criminal enforcement like you may have been before either 2014 or then 2018 Farm Bill. But putting these products or putting CBD or hemp derivatives in products which are then food products or dietary supplements and marketed as such, particularly those that are then marketed for interstate commerce or engaged in interstate commerce, is violative of our FDA standards. And so the Farm Bill specifically says that nothing in the Farm Bill is there to undermine the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act and the regulatory pathways that FDA has and upholds in order to ensure public health and safety for consumers. And so one of the things that we have done recently, which I'm sure folks are aware of, is we have said, the existing pathways in terms of food products or dietary supplement products are not appropriate for CBD, given the safety profile. There are a lot of concerns we have related to potential liver toxicity, reproductive toxicity, drug interactions, metabolic interactions when it comes to CBD, and that these are concerns that we don't have in the food category and that we don't have in the dietary supplement pathway, and it's not appropriate for these products to be under those regulatory frameworks. And so recognizing that this industry is a large industry, that consumers have folded these products into their daily lives, and that we need to make sure the consumers are aware of the potential risks, and that also we have the proper tools and mechanisms to mitigate potential harms. We announced that we are looking forward to working with Congress on a new regulatory pathway to address these issues so that we can make sure these products are standardized and they have a basic oversight and regulatory structures to protect public health and safety. One other thing that I would mention is we have not just seen CBD in the market. We have, as you alluded to, the Farm Bill didn't just do this and create a new world for CBD. It made a new world for all hemp derivatives. And so to the extent that we have seen a proliferation of intoxicating cannabinoids or synthetically derived cannabinoids, Delta-8, Delta-10, HHC, and that these products are widely available at gas stations and consumer convenience stores and online, that is something else that is extraordinarily concerning. Our concerns around CBD are more long-term with daily or chronic use, but the concerns that we have for these other products because of their intoxicating nature, the fact that we're seeing products that just didn't exist several months ago come into the market, and they have been associated with adverse events that have resulted in hospitalizations or in some cases even death. So that is something that we're very concerned about because this industry is very innovative, and consumers and industry participants deserve the regulatory certainty that can come with an appropriate regulatory pathway. And the last thing I'll say is a regulatory pathway that is appropriate and addresses the realities of the market. And the realities of the market are that these products are not just products which otherwise may resemble or be sold as foods and dietary supplements, but they also include topical applications, transdermal applications that are applied to the skin. They include products which are vaporized and inhaled or combusted and inhaled through smoking. They include products which are sold as eye drops or other routes of administration. And those are not routes of administration that would be covered under the food pathways or that fall under the definition of a dietary supplement. So in wanting to be proactive and wanting to put in place a regulatory framework that can address the realities of the market, that needs to be done through a new pathway that we are very interested in working with Congress to establish, as opposed to, as Sherry mentioned, cramming a square peg through a round hole.
It's a good point, Norman, on are good on all points. And I think just would add to that, that we have to recognize, as you pointed out, there are many different delivery mechanisms at play here. The historical path for cannabis would, of course, be combustion. Now that extraction is reasonably well refined and growing into its own, if you will, oral consumption is now reasonably popular for these materials. And as you said, transdermal is also a viable path. And my point is that typically, at least my experience from the food space and supplement space, is each one of these delivery mechanisms has to be looked at independently from a safety and a toxicity standpoint. And I think people sometimes forget that.
Chris,
Yeah, that's a great point. Just to comment on that very briefly, it wasn't so long ago that we had the EVALI, lung injury crisis, and that was specifically around products that were vaporized. And so understanding that there are various safety profiles and different regulatory mechanisms that need to be in place based off of a product's specific route of administration is something else that really needs to be factored in. Yeah,
and just to drill that down just a little bit further, if I recall correctly, in that case, it wasn't necessarily the active that was the problem; it was the delivery system, right? So as we, a cannabinoid can be presented, a cannabinoid that's entirely safe or deemed safe can be presented in a delivery system that is actually problematic.
in that case, Scott, were you talking about vitamin C acetate as medium, or are you speaking of something else? I thought we were talking.
No, I agree. I was trying to get my thing to unmute again. Yeah, I believe that is exactly the compound we're speaking of. And when you vaporize that, it's causing a problem for the lungs. It would almost be independent of what the active was that it was carrying.
Chris, you don't seem to have the same kinds of problems in Canada with Delta 8, Delta 10, THCO. Could you speak a little to how CBD and other hemp cannabinoids are developing in Canada? And curious as to why we don't see the proliferation in Canada of Delta 8, Delta 10, and other intoxicating derivatives.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the starting point for talking about hemp in general, as it relates to Canada versus the US market, is also clarifying that the definition is different. The adjective for cannabis, being hemp, actually has a different meaning in Canada versus the United States. The nuance really is, it's the same conversation about a 0.3% threshold. The nuance is that in Canada, you have to actually have your hemp seeds come from a list of approved cultivators that is listed by the federal government, that is managed by the federal government. So they actually establish what genetics for industrial hemp production are viable and which are not. And so you actually have to go based on that list. The list actually is a little bit of a moving target in terms of what genetics can kind of enter that list. Different breeders will, submit their seeds for review by Health Canada. And so just even that starting point of kind of how the product's approached is I think a little bit nuanced, because it as it relates to general kind of hemp in the United States, you can find what are effectively strains of cannabis in a more kind of flower-based cannabis approach, as opposed to an industrial textile product, that are incredibly low in THC, but that particular genetic would never be a viable hemp genetic in the Canadian market, if that makes sense. So you can actually kind of choose genetics that actually probably would never even be a viable industrial product, but would still be considered hemp in the United States and yield high amounts of cannabinoids. So they can actually be grown specifically for the extraction purposes, which I wouldn't necessarily say that was the entire spirit of the Farm Bill, but I think it's resulted in some interesting applications of that. So when you're talking about CBD in Canada, CBD is only available through the regulated system. So you actually have to go to a dispensary to get CBD products in Canada. You can't get them on Amazon. You can't get them in corner stores. It's still considered to be an active cannabinoid. The question about all these derivatives, essentially kind of the chemical force conversions producing things like Delta 9 or Delta 8, Delta 10, even Delta 9 is really a product of that conversion. those things are not hugely present in Canada. We're seeing a few Delta-8 products kind of try and toe into the market to see if there's an appetite for them. But I think the reason is that all these products, and Norman highlighted it, all these products that are derivatives are just workarounds to find a way to have an inebriating form of cannabis, right? Like you're trying to essentially find a way through the rules as they've been laid out to enjoy cannabis the way that you intend to. Well, in Canada, we don't need to, there's no circuitous path to go. You can just buy cannabis. It's federally regulated and legal. So there's no need to make unconventional cannabis products that are, when it comes to Delta-8, for example, the anecdotal description is that it's like Delta-9, but like 80% is as intense. So it's essentially, it's just, they're kind of slightly reduced versions of essentially the same effect as THC. So my read on it generally is that by having the market be open and have the option to just purchase the cannabis products that people want to buy, there isn't really a need to do a lot of this changing of actives and moving compounds around to introduce products that achieve the same effect as what essentially legalized cannabis would, but complies with the way the rules are laid out as it relates to percentage of actives and so on and so forth. So I'd say that's probably kind of your biggest difference is just, and it's also, my general understanding is that if you're going to be taking hemp, you may be able to get the actual raw material at a lower price point in terms of a commodity grade product, but then you're processing it. So you're actually adding additional layers of cost. Whereas if you could just grow, Delta-9 cannabis and sell that product right away, then you don't have to add those processing layers to what you're doing to essentially convert that CBD into new actives. But that's a question or a comment that Scott can probably be a lot more detailed on in terms of how that process works.
Well, thanks, Chris. You teed that up nicely, and I'm looking at a comment in the chat box of the question and answer. And I'll try to answer that, and I think that sort of takes us down that path. The question is, it worries me that we are so focused on regulating the cannabinoids when the cannabis plant is so much more. Will the new regulations continue to focus on cannabinoids? There are over 100, and that feels like a lot. And will there be a focus on terpenes as well? And there's a lot in that question, and it's I thank Joyce for asking that question. First off, yeah, there are a lot of cannabinoids present in the cannabis plant as well as other materials. It's a very rich plant chemically. Lots of terpenes, lots of cannabinoids, lots of flavonoids, on and on and on. I believe we're up to just right around 300 identified compounds in the cannabis plant today. But in answering the question, will there continue to be a focus on cannabinoids? I would suggest absolutely. And one of the reasons is, and it's something that Chris, I think, was alluding to, and Norman as well, the cannabis plant can be taken a lot of different directions through cultivation, crossbreeding, so on and so forth. And just a very upfront example of that is what we refer to as hemp in the United States, i.e. a low Delta-9 THC containing material, less than 0.3%, and contrast that to what we call cannabis, which often has a THC content upwards of 25% by weight. So there's a lot of range here that we're dealing with. Most of the other cannabinoids that we openly discuss, things like CBD, CBG, THCV, and on and on and on, actually occur at very low levels in the native cannabis plant. And it's through extraction, collection, and amplification, or chemical modification, if you will, that we are able to capture and isolate these, what are often referred to as minor cannabinoids, almost as pure materials, and present them. And it's in that context that, yes, we definitely need to be studying and looking at these materials from a safety and toxicity standpoint, because they're being presented to consumers in a format that's completely different from how they appear in the plant, period. Terpenes, it's an interesting question. And, my background in the food world tells me that, look, terpenes are everywhere. They're in almost every botanical source material. And it will surprise a lot of people in the cannabis space to hear me say this, but often terpenes from things other than cannabis are added to cannabis extracts, and they're the same they're the same terpenes. They're the same chemical compounds, myrcene, limonene, on and on and on, are found in many, many, many plants. They have regulatory status for the most part in food and supplements, and that's through the flavor industry. In this context, in the US, you'll hear the term FEMA GRAS, Flavor Extract Manufacturers Association, GRAS dossiers that are accepted by FDA, and GRAS, of course, stands for Generally Recognized as Safe. So in one context, many of the compounds that are in cannabis already are regulated and already have found their way into the food supply. I'm just thinking about this for the first time, but with a hemp plant, if we extract myrcene from hemp, well, myrcene is a food additive today. It already has a pathway into the food supply. Now, that doesn't say that the cannabinoids can come with it, but it's just something to remember when we start talking about the plant and the plant derivatives. So yes, we do need to be looking at the entire plant as well as its constituents, because it's often its constituents is what's being presented to consumers. So with that, I'll stop. I see a bunch more questions, and I think the next one was directed maybe for Norman.
Well, Scott, if I could just weigh in a little bit on that question as well. First, I agree. And, one of the things that we're talking about here at FDA is a regulatory structure that matches basically what the Farm Bill has done or may do in the upcoming reauthorization, which is, there's been a lot of focus on CBD. There's been a lot of focus on other cannabinoids that have entered into the market. Delta 8, there's an analysis that says it's a $2 billion market now in the US over the last 2 years, but there are other parts of the plant. There are terpenes in the plant. There are trichomes. There are all kinds of different substances. And this also touches a little bit on what you just said, which is, yes, there's flavoring regulations or pathways for food products, which may be applicable to certain hemp-derived products. But there are also hemp-derived products for which you do not want to go upon those that flavoring pathway, because you might be combusting that product and you might be inhaling that product. And especially, I believe it's a University of Portland study that showed that when you heat terpenes up to a certain degree, I believe it's somewhere around 730 degrees or so, then some terpenes are converted over to benzene, which is a known carcinogen that we're very familiar with from the tobacco industry. So this requires a lot of thought, and it also requires the proper regulatory structure for these products, which, again, we're very eager and to work with Congress on establishing, so that we can make sure that we have a regulatory structure and pathway in place that's appropriate given where the industry is and what consumers are looking for.
No, that's very good. And I should add that when I was referring to terpenes and GRAS status via FEMA, there is definitely qualifiers with that, used at their intended use level. And your comment is correct. Just because or I would agree with you, I should say, just because something's approved as a food additive does not mean it has approval for other delivery mechanisms such as combustion or even transdermal for that matter.
Correct.
Can I drop an audience question for Chris? There are now 7 DEA licensed cannabinoid research manufacturing organizations in the U.S. Are any of these organizations specifically doing research on therapeutics on CBD and other CBD-derived cannabinoids like CBC, CBG, CBN, et cetera? And if so, for what indications, and how and who determines the priorities of this research? Chris?
So specifically as it relates to the question, I think I would look to kind of define, I'm assuming you're referring to the DEA bulk manufacturer permits when you're describing organizations. And so the starting point there is like, these are private corporations. So in terms of determining what their actual research agenda is, It's somewhat limited. They're not required to disclose what they're intending to investigate. Certainly, there's a couple of those licenses that are held kind of or permits, I should say, be very specific. And those permits themselves are held kind of in conjunction with some academic institutions. One of the permits is held at University of Arizona Scottsdale, for example. And each organization has kind of their own specific goals. One has been quite vocal and focused on supporting research in veterans, use of cannabis for the management of PTSD, pain, or otherwise. And so that certainly is one direction of research. In terms of investigating kind of the phytocannabinoid spectrum, if you will, and really trying to understand what individual cannabinoids, are going to have specific bearing. They're like it's not really a question you can specifically answer. What I can say in general, because I have worked with a couple of these permit holders, is that the way that they look at cannabis is very different than the way that the state market and ultimately kind of the non-federally legal producers of cannabis look at the product, in the sense that these companies all have legal status with their cannabis. The products they're growing are legal. The products they're manufacturing are legal. They are permitted by the government to do this. And as a result, the results of their work will have access to the US Patent and Trade Office. So they'll be able to create customized formulations and intellectual property I'm going to dip my toe a little bit into Scott's world, but if you fractionate out these extracts and you actually separate out those individual cannabinoids and you find, say, a engineered ratio of CBG to CBN to CBD, that formula is a patent you can throw into that patent trade office. And if you can demonstrate efficacy against that, you're well on your way to an approved drug. So in general, I think that you've got the bulk permit manufacturers focused on kind of three main categories. One is clinical drug development, whether it's with academic institutions or privately themselves. One is supply, research supply, period. I think there is a long and well-documented history about the academic community's view of the product that is available from University of Mississippi and the historical tender that NIDA has awarded to Mississippi for product production. My personal kind of comment on that is I always found it surprising that it was never specific in terms of the actual THC concentration. So you'd purchase either 0 to 5, 5 to 10, or 10 plus, and you kind of had a little bit of a range there, which is a variance that would never be acceptable in clinical research. So the new permit holders are actually introducing new product that is a lot more accurate representation of cannabis that people consume medically. The third bucket that these producers are curious about looking at is that they have the ability to sell their products into legal medical markets outside of the United States. So you have the ability, if you have this bulk permit, to manufacture a product and export it to a country where it's federally legal on a medical level. That said, there's nuances to that, and getting to that point is a bit challenging, mainly because the permit holders at a federal level have no regulations. So this is, a nod to Norm, but the permits that are being issued by the DEA, which is a law enforcement agency, have absolutely no oversight or involvement in a kind of a production sense from the FDA. There's no rule set for how they're producing. So if they want to export products outside the United States, they effectively have to meet an international standard, which historically it's going to be something that's a combination of the Canadian Cannabis Act and the Australian TGO 93, which are two kind of fairly uniform production standard requirements. And then the second piece is going to be some form of international GMP standard, whether it's Australian or European Union. So those are the three directions that these companies could be or are focused. What I would say is the individual cannabinoids, if you go to clinicaltrials.gov, it's a good page to refresh if you want to look at different stuff that's being investigated. Specific products tend to be pretty listed, or at least the actives involved in them as well.
Chris, are they actively producing in these licensed bulk manufacturers? And if so, what kind of products, if they are they producing, or do they seek to produce?
So yes, to my knowledge, most of them are growing cannabis. The interesting nuances of the permit system is they actually have to, in order to, transit their cannabis products in any way, the products actually have to be purchased from the DEA. So they sell them. There's a transaction where they're sold to the DEA and purchased back for their own uses. So the DEA actually is the distributor for the bulk permit holders. To my knowledge, almost all of them are focused on flower production. If you look at kind of the way that you build cannabis companies, the way that they've emerged, you really do start, if you need to be vertically integrated, which similar to the early Canadian industry, these operators need vertical integration. There's no way for them to outsource extraction to, well, actually they could. That's not true. They could outsource extraction to a Schedule 1, license holder who has the ability to do manufacturing, but not necessarily production. But for the most part, they're growing. To my knowledge, they're growing and they're looking at, traditional kind of medical focused products. So you'd be looking at primarily oils, topicals, encapsulated products, things that you can ingest, not necessarily a smoke cannabis focus for a lot of these operators.
And do you know where they're distributing? Are they currently distributing those products somewhere in the United States or other countries?
So there has not yet been. I'm aware of an export permit that was issued to one of the operators. That's as much as I can, because of my involvement, as much as I can disclose. But as far as transactional sales, there hasn't been anything leaving the United States. I do believe that one operator on the West Coast, Bayer Pharmaceutical Research Company, is supplying a study at the University of San Diego. I don't know where that is in the continuum. When it comes to supplying these studies and getting involved, there's a lot of other regulatory pieces that need to come in, including drug master files, in actually registering your study and setting those things up. But to my knowledge, yeah, they are growing, and there has been some transactional work, smaller scale studies at this point, but they're only a year old, really. So it takes time to really get the plane off the ground, if you will.
This is a general question for anyone on the panel. Are we moving towards synthetic cannabinoids, or is it possible to retain the whole plant and utilize it as a medicine? Legally, federally legally.
So I'll just throw in there that we've had synthetic cannabinoids available for like decades. Marinol is like the one that's often brought up as like an approved drug. It has, like, anecdotally and head to head, in terms of what I've seen from Canadian data, it has nowhere near the same impact as cannabis. There's a number of different reasons, whether it's route of administration, whether it's other active cannabinoids or otherwise. So I think we're moving away from that, or I think that it already exists in a way. So and it's not particularly lucrative or popular. And if it was, it would be genericized at this point. So you'd be able to get as many capsules for pennies on the dollar. The flip side to it is that Pfizer just bought, a drug dev company that's exclusively focused on basically making a CBD analog that's synthetic. This is all the news about Pfizer buying a cannabis company. They're not. They bought a company that's trying to produce a synthetic analog to CBD. So it's a traditional drug, but they are actually trying to make a synthetic CBD and see if that can have, a similar effect on I would assume, the categories that Epidiolex is currently approved for at this point.
Yeah, and Sherry, to answer your question from a couple different points of view, we have recently put out here at FDA guidance to stakeholders who are looking to develop cannabis-derived drugs, whether those are single analogs or single components and single cannabinoid dominant drugs, or whether they're botanically, in a botanical form. I'd really suggest everyone to take a look at that. A colleague of mine, Cassie Taylor, was a primary author on that, and that went out actually a couple days before our announcement related to calling for a new regulatory pathway for hemp-derived products. From a market standpoint, I think we're certainly seeing the market shift towards you know, cannabinoid specific products. When we look at, you know, more mature markets moving away from flower, and don't get me wrong, flower is still, you know, the dominant product in most state markets, and understanding that flower is not the only, you know, product which is a full spectrum product, but we're seeing increases in edibles and beverages and in you know, vaped products, which typically do not have that full range of composition from the plant, and, you know, may not give people the entourage effect, so to speak. So you know, I think there's also advantages when you're looking at scale in terms of your formulation and operating at scale, to being able to pinpoint a few major or primary constituents of the product or cannabinoids, as opposed to you know, a full spectrum extract or a full spectrum product. So, you know, for a couple of different reasons there, I imagine that the trend is moving away from full spectrum products. However, we certainly acknowledge the potential benefit there, and again, would highly encourage everyone to take a look at that recent guidance that we put out.
I just add to build off what you're saying, Norman. I think, like, if I was going to describe what, because there's a little bit of this kind of nomenclature thing where it's like, you know, botanically derived versus full spectrum versus is it plant derived? Is it a single molecule? Is it natural or otherwise? To, like, if I'm looking at the landscape and to your point, like the botanical drug development standards in that approach, the real path for a full spectrum, if we're kind of, you know, give that a parameter for that type of product to market, is one that's actually probably engineered out of naturally derived isolates, meaning that you can actually standardize those things within the variance that's required to meet those production standards. So you could have something that has, you know, 2% CBG and 1% CBN and 0.5% CBC and a bunch of THC and all this stuff. And if those ratios can be consistent, well, then you've got a product that is consistent, and that can follow, actually it could follow the current drug development path if you can keep all those parameters controlled, although it'd be an interesting juggling act in terms of the manufacturing end of things and scaling it up. But there is a way to bring a natural cannabis drug to market that has all of the components that, you know, the questions that are being asked in the chat. The one area that will probably be, I'd say, not necessarily part of the continuum because of the volatility, and maybe I'm again throwing it to you, Scott, is terpenes, right? Terpenes are, if you can smell them, they're changing. If you can smell a terpene, it's changing, right? The smell you get that's hitting your olfactory sensors is literally a chemical reaction of that myrcene turning into something else. If you ever run terpenes through a mass spectrometer, you know that it's more artifacts, meaning for the audience, meaning things we don't know what they are, than there are actual things that are consistently marked with standards. So, and then this is like kind of an asterisk for people on terpenes, is like everybody talks about terpenes, and I think that terpenes have some sort of role to play in the cannabis plant and its effects. But it's important to remember that terpenes produce turpentine, right? That turpentine is terpenes extracted from large wood, and that's paint thinner. And so if you're talking about terpenes in large volumes, we talk about things that may be safe for topical use or otherwise, or ingestion or otherwise, understanding that there are components of the plant that if they're in large amounts may not be so good for you. Terpenes, a perfect example. If Scott, you've worked in a lab, I'm sure your Rotovap's got no measurement lines on the side of it because the terpenes strip them off. And I think that's also, you know, an important thing to kind of think about as well when we're thinking about kind of the broad conversation about how you bring, you know, standardized product forward.
Yeah, it's a very rich topic area to discuss, and I'm also going to try to address some of the questions that popped up in the chat here. Terpenes are low molecular weight, fairly reactive materials. As presented in the plant or as presented in nature, typically they're at extremely low levels. They are very volatile. That's why we smell them so easily. But this kind of speaks again to the need for continued research or open up the channels for research in the United States so that safety, toxicity, and efficacy can all be studied, and the knowledge necessary to bring these materials to market, to leverage their power, leverage their benefits. I maybe opened up a little bit of a can of worms when I started talking about terpenes and food. There are a lot of qualifiers that come with that. When you get a GRAS status for a food ingredient or a food additive, it's very descriptive of the fingerprint of what you're bringing forward, the quantification, the monograph, if you will. It's also limited or very descriptive with respect to its permitted use level based on its toxicological and safety dossier that's presented to capture status. And in the world of terpenes, for example, those use levels are typically very low in the flavor world as flavoring materials. And it's for exactly the reason Chris mentioned. Without trying to scare anybody, almost everything on this planet is poisonous at the right dose. The trick here is to find out the boundaries of safe use and then introduce materials to consumers through whatever the mechanism is, if it's through a food additive path or a supplement path, so on and so forth, to ensure that we're doing it in a safe manner. So it's not that it's circular, but my personal view is safety needs to be determined first before scope of use can be determined, right? And that's kind of what we're talking about here. The plant is very rich and it is very variable. USP has taken a shot, or I shouldn't say taken a shot. They're working very diligently on a monograph for cannabis, cannabinoids, so on and so forth. And their approach on terpenes is interesting. Because while they are not yet to the point where they're trying to set a range limit for every specific terpene under a specific strain of cannabis, they have said no individual terpene is permitted to exceed X level, which makes it representative of the plants that are being grown as opposed to the extractions and amplifications that are taking place. So, really what I'm trying to say is, to me, there's a lot to be said about safety and materials. And yeah, we do have to look at these individual compounds because each one of them will have its own safety profile, and then it complicates further because of potential interactions. It's a very rich plant. And we're manipulating it quite a bit. And then through extraction, we're further manipulating what the extract might be. It may not even resemble what came from the plant. And then lastly, along this, there's another consideration when we start talking about broad spectrum and full spectrum, which we need tighter definitions of as an industry. But that what comes out of the plant is somewhat dependent on the solvent used for extraction. I will not get the same thing if I extract with butane versus carbon dioxide versus cryogenic ethanol. I can start with the same plant, and each one of those extracts are going to be somewhat chemically different. Mm-hmm. So that takes me back to, I think, one of the most important things as we navigate these channels, extracting the value of the plant as a medicine, making it available for those that want to use it recreationally. Are we doing it in a safe manner?
Yeah.
Thanks, Scott. I have another audience question. We've got about 10 minutes left, so we'll try and get to maybe two more in the time we've got. So the hemp industry is eons ahead of the cannabis industry in terms of R&D into minor cannabinoids. Any regulations that are put forward ought not stunt that research. Do you agree that if regulations limit the hemp industry from creating these products, that the public may never be granted access to them? I'll let any of our panelists respond.
Yeah, I'll jump in if that's okay. Research is paramount, right? We need more research. There's so much that we don't know or that we should know more of, and there are so many parts of this plant. And so completely agree that research should not be stifled at all. In fact, there was, I think, the first standalone cannabis-related bill passed last session under the previous Congress was a research bill. And so one thing to note, though, is there's a difference between encouraging research so that we have better data and opening up the doors in terms of, access by consumers or marketing certain substances or components without the appropriate research to make various therapeutic claims, which is something that we see often, unfortunately, in the cannabis industry. So the real question is, how can we encourage research and invest in research without undermining consumer safety, and also without undermining the existing drug pathway when it comes to products that are making therapeutic claims, because we do see that products are doing that without the proper evidence to back it up. But absolutely, making sure there's more R&D is paramount and really important.
I just build on that to say it's also like one of the things that I've run into the last 10 years is the reality of what research has been done versus what people think what research has been done in general, right? So that there is actually a much larger body of, I would say, more echo chamber anecdotal evidence on the internet than there actually has been investigated in controlled settings. And so when people say things like CBN is a sleep aid, there is not a single source that you will find that tells you that cannabinol is a sedating product from cannabis that's been conducted in a lab or otherwise. And I chase it around the internet, you will not find a primary source. And I think that what's important to understand is that there's so much anecdotal dialogue about cannabis because it's existed in the shadows, so to speak, for so long that people conflate the anecdotal experience with what science we actually have to back it up. And so that investment in research, as Norm is saying, is paramount. And you would be surprised at how little research there is out there. We get a lot of citations about terpenes, for example, and I'll say this quickly. All of the evidence for terpenes is, as Scott said before, not based on cannabis-derived terpenes. It's based on other botanically derived ones, things from lemons and lavender. And the actual evidence that shows that linalool has an anxiolytic effect is based on conducting a small-scale olfactory study for aromatherapy that was published in the 90s. So the form of ingestion is completely different. The substance is different. It's not part of cannabis. It's the whole exercise has been conflated into cannabis-derived linalool is an anxiolytic. Understanding the reality of that is very different. So I'll leave it there and just say, like, the research that we actually have out there needs more data. We need more of it so that it can round out these corners. And a really great place to start is trying to either prove or disprove a lot of the public anecdote around specific cannabinoids having specific effects.
I can't help but ask this question, which is, how do we not let the perfect get in the way of the good? In other words, how can we start to regulate without understanding all that we need to understand, because we have a complete marketplace out there. And so we're trying to balance knowing everything with safety. And one of the things I realize is that the FDA does say is the current science says today. So I guess, again, what do we do so we can start regulating a market that we don't have all the answers on? Does anybody have a thought on that?
Yeah, Sherry, that concept. Oh, Scott, please.
Well, I'll just keep it very brief. I think part of that answer is establishing risk tolerance and understanding the spectrum of what we mean when we say safe versus potential harm, and then what range are we willing to accept for the population we're making materials available to. With that, I'll let you answer, Norm.
No, that whole notion, I think, is integral and just at the center of what we are hoping to put in place with Congress, which is a regulatory framework that takes into consideration the realities of the market, the realities of consumers right now, and is focused on harm mitigation. It is not saying we need to understand every single facet of the safety profile of this product, but being able to say to consumers, here's what we don't know, or here's what we do know, here is what the risk profile may be, and take that into consideration, and also improving the safety profile of these products, because we have lack of standardization in manufacturing processes. We do not have truth in labeling. We do not have standardization in labeling, so consumers can actually know at least what the manufacturer is claiming is within the product, right? So when we look at these various things that consumers just expect to have in place, which unfortunately are extraordinarily variable in this industry because of how fragmented it is on a state-by-state basis, and because of the lack of regulatory certainty, it's really that question. So if we can address some of these issues, if we can make sure that what's on the label is in the product, and if we can make sure that the consumer is aware of the potential risks associated with that product, and if we can take the most harmful products that you could imagine, injectables or things that, there are products out there with 250 milligrams of an intoxicating cannabinoid in one gummy dose, right? There are a lot of questions that need to be answered, but there is a huge wide open lane to move down in terms of pursuing harm reduction and harm mitigation, and not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good.
I'd say I love hearing that from you, Norman. I think the other area, and this is, for anybody in the audience's benefit, is that if you are a CBD consumer, which I think many people are, the number one question that I would ask, and that I recommend people ask if they're purchasing CBD, is reach out to the company and understand what kind of recall infrastructure they have in place. Because that's another example of something that comes with regulation, right? Is that infrastructure to ensure that safety communications go out, that you're actually able to pull these things back. Because as we know, as Scott said, you get different compounds with different extraction methods. There's different approaches to these things. And it may be found out that, we have some other compound that's out there, or one of these derivatives of CBD has similar effects to vitamin E acetate did in vaporizing. So just another thing that I think would be another example of, adding to that regulatory framework is having a recall infrastructure that's really transparent, so people can always be able to access that too.
And Chris, I've just got to say that is such a good point, and is so important. Yeah. Especially as we look at reports of adverse events from some of these products, and also thinking back to what happened during the EVALI crisis. I can recall at that point I was in Rhode Island, but on coordinating calls between state cannabis regulators and the CDC and their investigators, trying to pinpoint what's the source here. And we were able to say with a fair degree of confidence, okay, we don't think it's coming from our medical programs. We don't think it's coming from our adult use programs. And the question was, well, what about the hemp sector? What about these products? And what we heard from the investigators were, we can't ask the questions. The average consumer doesn't have the cognitive understanding to differentiate between even CBD and THC, to be able to tell us unless they have the actual product so that we can run testing. And if you look at some data that comes out of California, actually, the ICPS survey from the University of Waterloo, it's alarming the number of monthly or somewhat frequent consumers who mistake CBD for THC as the cannabinoid that gets them high. And so with regulation doesn't just come traceability and visibility to be able to react. It also comes consumer education. So consumers can become better informed, they can make better choices. And also when there are adverse events, they can then provide the information so that we can use regulatory systems in order to institute a recall and make the environment safer for everyone, and have more confidence for all consumers.
Norm, I'm going to let you be the last word here, and I thank you. That was said very eloquently. We have a lot of concerns in getting the Congress to act quickly. I'm not going to go into that. We hope that some regulation comes into place, and education of the consumer on all other stakeholders. And that's why CFCR is here, and I want to thank each of you, Chris, Scott, Jack, of course, and Norm, for being here today and helping to share your knowledge, which is quite stunning, with our audience. Thank you. Jack?
Thank you, Sherry, and thank you all for our audience for joining us today. Our next webinar will be on Thursday, March 30th again at 1 p.m. Eastern. And we'll have a panel joining us to discuss intoxicating hemp-derived cannabinoids. So probably of interest to most of today's audience members. Sherry?
And thank you, Jack. And hopefully we will see you next month. And if you have some things of particular interest, audience members, please be sure to share them with us and let us know what you're interested in hearing about as well.
There's going to be a short survey as you log out. We'd appreciate it if you fill that out. And everybody have a great day. And we're clear.
All right.
Yeah, we are clear.
Nice.
Great presentation.
So